7:30, Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. When National Review founder William F. Buckley described the convert to conservatism as a liberal who had been mugged by reality.
Oh yeah, I love
he
that.
He didn't mean literally. He meant like intellectually, like I've confronted what is real and I realize that conservatism is more reflective of how the commonsensical person deals with the reality of the human condition. Unfortunately, in Chicago, to get a person to that point, get so many people to that point, it requires a literal mugging. That's the standard. I give you Anthony Driver. Anthony Driver is the president of the Community Commission on Public Safety and Accountability. He is now calling for the Chicago Police Department to relax its restrictions on vehicle pursuits because sharp controls on said pursuits have encouraged robberies by criminals who believe they are unlikely to be chased. Oh, you don't say. You know how Anthony Driver came to this realization?
How?
He was the victim of an armed robbery while walking near his South Side home. Two teenagers jumped out of a tan SUV, stuck a gun in his abdomen, made off with his wallet. When I was robbed, they had robbed 6 people before me, literally. They pulled up, and when they robbed me, they threw out purses. They dumped the purses in the street, said Driver. I'm hearing from Chicagoans, I'm hearing from police officers and stakeholders that this is something needs to be looked at. We can't hide or run from this issue anymore. I don't think there was a lot of public input from either the general public or officers when this policy was created. Oh, really? You don't think so? Where have you been? I mean, I'm glad he's saying something, you know, but I mean, good grief. This is why getting a handle on the rampant violent crime in Chicago is so painstaking. In a bygone era, things were different. Jerry Finnigan is a decorated and notorious former Chicago police officer. He's both decorated and notorious. And how a decorated police officer becomes notorious, well, that's a conversation we're going to have with him. He's the subject of a new podcast called Finnigan's Take. And it's produced by our friend Neil Edelstein, who's a great Hollywood producer. I mean, he's a really good storyteller. Edelstein was on, he was a producer on The Straight Story with David Lynch. David Lynch directed, Richard Farnsworth, Sissy Spacek. I mean, that's one of the most beautiful movies in the last 30 years, as well as he produced The Ring, Mulholland Drive. So now he's produced, he's the interviewer of Jerry Finnigan for this podcast called Finnigan's Take, and it's about crime in Chicago. The first 2 episodes have been released, and because we're friends, we got an advance on some of the forthcoming episodes. And it's just interesting to hear Finnigan's take, if you will, on what it used to be like. He was 20 years on CPD starting in 1988. So from the end of the last century to the beginning of this one, just this little exchange on police chases when he was on the force.
The rule of the street is, and I don't know how that's everywhere else, but in Chicago, if you ran from the police, you got an ass whipping. That's just the way it was, and that was citywide. If you didn't make the police chase you, it went a little easier on you. But if you're running, jumping fences, and getting everybody sweated up, and then you're going to resist, you're going to get an ass whipping. And that's the way it was.
And because this was somewhat the rules of the game.
That's correct.
Most people abided by this knowledge, usually.
Most of the guys, most of the gangbangers, they just took the ass whipping. And that was the end of it. It wasn't personal. So you went in and I mean, you didn't beat them till they had to go to the hospital, but you gave them some punches in the stomach, took them in, and then, you bought them a soda, and, they're going to jail. And, I mean, if they weren't assholes, sometimes, man, I'd buy them a sandwich. I mean, what's the big deal? It wasn't personal. That was the way it was out there. They knew the rules, and they broke the rules, so that's the way it was.
Finnigan's Take, the podcast, can be found on Spotify and Apple. Jerry Finnigan joins us now. Jerry, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Dan and Amy. Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Well, so the obvious question is, how does somebody go from being I mean, you've got awards from ATF, from Cook County Sheriff, from Chicago Police, most illegal guns off the street, multiple years running when you were on the force. So how does somebody go from being that Chicago police officer to a former Chicago police officer who got sentenced to 10 years in federal prison?
Yeah, Dan, I contemplated that very often to myself after the fact, but actually I gave in to greed. We were recovering millions of dollars in illicit drugs and firearms, but the money that we recovered, we never turned in. And kind of like the reasoning, I thought, and the guys I was with said, well, it's dope money. Who is it going to hurt? I'm not taking some woman's money who's an old woman, but really, when it all boils down to it, that was just to make myself feel better, I guess, because it was illegal, and I wish I would have kept my hands in my pockets because it ruined my career. It was actually the best job I ever had. I loved it.
And the what you ultimately pled out to, though, was so income tax evasion on the stolen money, but also a murder for hire plot.
That's correct. I mean, Dan, the show's not long enough, and
yeah, I understand.
Not long enough to explain everything, but truly, I said something I should not have said, but there was no act of furtherance. There was no the supposed hitman that I was looking to hire was a figment of the imagination of the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. There was nobody involved besides myself. And like I said, it was a dumb thing for me to do, and I regret it. I was not going to plead to that, but my lawyer told me give them their pound of flesh, and it'll go easier for me in court and later in prison where I could go to a camp. But apparently he wasn't truthful about that.
I just wanted to ask, I was working at Channel 5 when that picture came out of you and Tim McDermott, and you're sitting down.
Yes.
There's antlers on a black man, and you guys are holding weapons.
Yes.
Who's the black dude in that picture?
Oh, that kid. Yeah, that kid. He was a juvenile at the time, and he was later killed in a drive-by shooting. His brother was the gang leader for the traveling vice lords in the 11th district, LeVar Spann. And that gentleman's name, I don't remember the young man's name, his first name, but Spann was his last name. Amy, actually, it was like a joke, and it was a bad joke. It was strictly my idea. Mm-hmm. I equated us to being hunters, and on that picture I wrote, this 12-point buck was shot on Chicago's Wild Wild West Side.
Yeah, I remember.
There was no racial intent involved in that. If it would have been in a white neighborhood, I would have did it to a white kid. Unfortunately, I didn't work in white neighborhoods. But it was a joke, and probably the worst joke I ever committed.
Well, what did he think about the whole thing? Was he just compliant? You told him to get down? Like, how did that transpire?
Oh, yeah. Well, we took him into the station, Amy. We actually got him with 90 bags of cannabis, on the drug, on the scene where he was selling it. And the 600 block of North Avers, his family controlled that area. So I told him if he let me take a picture, that I would let him go, which I did. I didn't charge him with the cannabis. Probably not a good idea, but the thing is, nothing would happen to him anyway. He was a juvenile.
So, take us back, the clip I played from a forthcoming episode of your interviews with Neil Edelstein for Finnigan's Take, talking about police chases. Take us back to sort of the good and the bad and the ugly of the era where you were a decorated police officer before things turned. and what lessons maybe, particularly from the good, may need to be revisited with the Chicago police today?
Yeah, Dan, I would think that Lisa Madigan enacting the consent decree was the end of policing in Chicago. Coupled with the cameras, the thing is, policemen do not want to be on the front page, be the next person who's indicted for putting their hands on somebody, even if that person is resisting. These cameras out there, these cell phone cameras, they don't tell the whole story. They're only showing little blurbs of what the news and what these people who are taking these videos want to show you. So the police back then, at the time I was the police, we had full autonomy over the city. Legitimately. I mean, you would go in neighborhoods, you would go to war with these guys physically and have to fight with them to take them to jail. Now, there's no respect for the police. You can see that by the crime in Chicago is just completely out of control. I don't know what the police department is going to do to address it. I don't have much confidence in the leadership. I know that superintendent worked in the 7th District. Like I said, I don't know if he's capable of changing things, but he's going to take his marching orders from the 5th floor, and Mayor Johnson is not going to let him come out there and be heavy-handed. And I'm not saying beat people down. Go ahead, Amy.
Well, I'm sorry I interrupted. I thought you were done speaking. But what do you think? Like, there's no foot chase policy, no chasing. What do you think about that? I mean, that was an important tool for you guys back then.
Well, Amy, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, whoever enacted these policies were not the police. They were attorneys that worked for the police department, never worked the street, had office jobs their whole career. Some of these bosses, you cannot police people out here without getting in foot chases. That is absolutely absurd. The same with the vehicle chases. The robberies are out of control here. There was an incident where a 12th District car just within the last couple of weeks got behind a vehicle, called it in. He was a one-man car. 4 guys heavily armed, just committed 6 robberies. His sergeant immediately called that chase off. It wasn't even a chase. He was following the car. So, I mean, if the citizens of Chicago realize that it's very unsafe out there, and the police department have their hands tied as officers, the everyday street guys and women. So I feel very bad for the citizens, and I feel bad for the police because they're not enabled to do their job anymore.
Back when you were on the force, would you say that the pendulum had swung too far in the direction of police autonomy, and now clearly it swung too far in the direction of handcuffing the police and politicians having the autonomy to sort of direct policing, if you will? I mean, or do you look back at the time that you were on the force and say we should cut and paste that time and apply it to today?
I would agree with that because Dan, here's the thing. Back then, like I said, the bad guy out there, if you worked in a certain area of the city, you got to know the bad players in your district. And on citywide, I mean, you could come across these hot spots, and these guys were out there doing no good. But the problem is, nowadays, and I think previous, that should be brought back. I don't condone beating people. But on the other hand, these individuals out here are committing these crimes. They're not worried about the police doing their jobs anymore because they know the police aren't going to street stop them. They know the police aren't going to stop them in vehicles and go through their vehicles to recover these guns. You have all these individuals out here, even the juveniles, committing robberies. And this is seriously, when you think about it, it's a conspiracy, and that's what the federal government should come into play here. They conspire to do these robberies.
Back in the day when we had kingpins like Jeff Fort or Larry Hoover, that really had sort of operational, my understanding as a layman, so correct me if I'm wrong, but seemingly had operational control of the distribution of power and turf in the city. Was that what was the relationship like between the police and those gang kingpins, and how is that different from today?
Well, you knew who the leaders were. The leaders weren't in prison. Well, of course, Jeff Fort was and Larry Hoover, but you knew who to go to the next guy. Our gang intelligence would address these guys. They do long-term investigations. I would encounter the guys who were the mid-level, although Wakita Fort was Jeff Fort's son, and I encountered him on a regular basis in the south end of the 9th District. And we used to have a talk, and I would tell him that the shooting's got to stop over here. Dan, you're not going to stop the war on drugs because it's just not going to stop here.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, there's so much violence, and these gangs have splintered off into different factions now. It's hard to get a grasp on who's running what area.
Right, and so, I mean, we had Jody Weiss on the show a few months back, and he was talking about that gang summit that he had when he was CPD superintendent and the criticism he got. But his argument was, basically you have to, it's sort of what you're saying. He didn't quite say it that way, but this is what he was intimating, that, this is the landscape, and I can't fundamentally change the landscape, but what I can do is try and get to the shot callers and get some sort of rules of the game to reduce the violence as much as possible. And if you don't engage them, then you have no chance to do that.
I agreed with that gang summit with Weiss. I did not know the man. I'm not much on a person who comes from the outside to run a police department who does not go up the ranks.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I think by him meeting with these gang leaders, with his command staff, you can curtail some of the activity out there that they're doing. But the driving force is the drugs, and the money. That's what it is, and that's what's creating and perpetuating this violence because of the money involved in it, and that's why you have the shootings. But Dan and Amy, I don't really care about the gangbangers. I mean, that's the life they choose. But it's these children and these women who are prisoners in their own neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. And where are these organizations like Black Lives Matter when a child is killed out here? It's crickets. You don't hear a word about it. But if a policeman does something minor or even a little on the edge of being maybe illegal, it's in the news for weeks and months.
I mean, if you were John Catanzara, FOP head, what is the one thing that you would die on a hill on? Say, we have got to get this. We don't have something that we need now. This is the thing. If you're going to give me one thing to improve policing and, by extension, public safety in Chicago, give me this thing.
Yeah, John's a good guy, and he's for his guys, and he's a great president. So with that being said, the money part doesn't come into play. But the thing is, I think that he should go and sit down with the mayor and the superintendent and tell them, take the gloves off. Let these police officers come out here and do their jobs without worrying about COPA or worrying about internal affairs, hammering these guys, not condoning violence, but for being a little heavy-handed, putting the pressure on these other gangs out on the street. Something has to be done. But right now, like I said, the police officers, the rank-and-file people, they have their hands tied. And I still speak to a lot of guys and girls. And honestly, Dan and Amy, they've taken the wind out of their sails.
He is Jerry Finnigan, a former Chicago police officer. The podcast, Finnigan's Take, as brought to us by Hollywood producer Neil Edelstein. It's available at Spotify and Apple. First couple episodes are out, but you can tell we're just scratching the surface here. Jerry Finnigan, thanks so much for joining us, and good luck with the podcast. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. You guys have a great day.
Thank you, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
A storm is on the horizon, and you need to keep the lights on no matter what. Your business relies on the power being on 24/7. It's the lifeblood of your data and computer systems. Weather-related outages from the power company are not acceptable. Your need for a source of power that's reliable